Lata Mangeshkar, Mohammad Rafi, Chup Gaye Sare Nazare. All the glances are hushed from the 1969 film Door Raste, and of course, classic monsoon Bollywood dancing. You're tuned in to me, Fazana Chowdhury. This is BBC Three Counties Radio, BBC Radio Northampton. It's 12 minutes past 8 o'clock. Now, the history of people converting to Islam in this country goes all the way back to Victorian times. And one of the earliest converts was a woman who helped build Britain's first Muslim convert community. Her name was Fatima Elizabeth Cates. Now, the process of uncovering her story has been a labour of love for Hamid Mahmood, who now runs a school named after her. And he's also written her biography, and he joins us on the line now. Good evening, Hamid. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, what an amazing lady. What was it about Fatima? How did you first of all find out about her?
So it was the last year of my undergraduate degree where I purchased a book that just came out by Professor Ron Jeeves on a figure called Abdullah William Henry Quilliam, who's known as one of the first or earliest Victorian men to convert to Islam. And it was all about him. And in that book, there was one short paragraph about a lady called Fatima Elizabeth Cates. And when I read about, and it was her own story telling, the readers how she accepted Islam and the suffering and the sacrifices that she went through, that I wanted to know more. So I did contact the author, Professor Ron Jeeves, and asked him if there was more information on her, and to my surprise there wasn't any, even though there was so much about Abdullah Quilliam, who's the founder of the first mosque of England. Fatima Elizabeth Cates, as we now discover, happens to be the co-founder of the very first mosque of England on 8 Brougham Terrace. So that was the first time I came across the name, and as I was reading it, it kind of, struck my head and as a thunderbolt that if I had a weekend school or supplementary school, I'd definitely name it after Fatima Elizabeth Cates, just to revive her story.
Exactly. And do you know what's astonishing is she was the actual co-founder, yet she's just relegated to a little paragraph and there wasn't really much information about her. Was it easy to find out information about her?
No, it was a challenge. So I was researching her ad hoc. So I've worked like almost 7 days a week. So, but I still had, I was passionate enough to find more about her. I had finished my master's in history at the time, and specifically history of Islam and the West. And this, fits in really well. So it took around 6 years of ad hoc research, where at times a lot of it would be online, a lot of it I would go over to Liverpool and research her life. So even, for example, finding her grave was a challenge, but we ultimately found her grave, which was unmarked. Now it's been, it's got a headstone there, which was, money was gathered together by a sister called Amira Scarisbrick, who's also a new Muslim from Liverpool, and now there's a headstone there just only last year.
Yeah. And what was the story behind her conversion? How did she convert? What were some of the events leading to that?
Yeah, interesting. So she was between 19 to 22 years of age, where she happened to join a movement in Birkenhead. So her life didn't begin in Liverpool. It was actually across the River Mersey in Birkenhead, small town. And there she joined a movement called the Temperance Movement, which was kind of starting in America, coming over to England. And it was about abolishing alcohol in England. And she was very, very passionate to such an extent that she even became the secretary of the Birkenhead Workingmen's Temperance Society. And she was only around 19 at the time. And she then heard of a man about to give a lecture on temperance in Birkenhead Workingmen's Temperance Hall called Mr. Abdullah or Mr. Quilliam. And she may have been part of organizing that lecture. And it was called Fanatics and Fanaticism. And Mr. Quilliam, so just a bit of context on him to find out, how this comes about. Mr. Quilliam fell ill, and he was asked to go to a hot country to be treated. So he went to Morocco, and in Morocco he came across Muslims, and he looked at the Brotherhood, and it was his chance to really explore the Abrahamic religions. He was Christian himself at the time, but not really practicing anymore. He had no longer, believed in Christianity. So he got closer to the Abrahamic religions, so Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And he had a choice between Judaism and Islam, and ultimately he accepts Islam. When he came back, he thinks of many different ways to propagate his faith. So he tried the direct approach, it fell on its face. But then he was also known as the temperance child. So as a child, he kind of, stopped drinking alcohol and, ensured that he would work for the Temperance Society. So when he comes back, he then uses the temperance movement as, as a vehicle to spread Islam.
Right.
And he had just a week earlier given a lecture in Liverpool on fanatics and fanaticism, and there he gained his very first convert. And we're talking June 1887.
Wow.
His very first convert was Mr. James Hamilton. And after the lecture, Mr. Hamilton approaches him and says, "Look, I'm interested and I want to become a Muslim." So then they're walking in the dark of the night in Liverpool, and Abdullah Quilliam tells him, "Look, usually we have this, process called the Shahada where we have witnesses. However, I'm the only other Muslim I know, so we will have to make Allah or God our
witness." Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Wow.
So that's where it began. And then the following week, this happens in Birkenhead. And Frances Elizabeth Murray, her name at the time, she happened to be sitting beside Mr. James Ali Hamilton in that second lecture that Abdullah
It was
Quilliam
to
delivered.
be, wasn't it? It was just,
Yeah,
it was
absolutely,
to be. Yeah. Temperance is such a great word. I haven't heard that since O-level history. So that takes me back. What would have worship been like, around that era in kind of mosques and things like that? Because, I mean, of course, they would be probably converted buildings. What would worship be like? Because there would have been so few other Muslims.
And what's fascinating about the question is, if we completely go back to that period, we've got to understand that these early Muslims who just accepted Islam, they started with the trio, with the three, and over about 2.5 years it became 14. They had no contact pretty much with the outside Muslim world. So everything Abdullah Quilliam, he's kind of researching in his books. He doesn't have direct contact with Muslims because you don't have the internet, or you don't have anything else. So a lot of it, they were taking and borrowing from Church of England and also the temperance movement itself. So, for example, they had a book called the Allegiance Book. You would have to sign that and swear an allegiance on 3 things. So one being God being one, Prophet Muhammad his messenger, and that the Quran is the divinely inspired book of God and the actual speech of God. And then they would sign that just as they would sign a similar kind of book when entering a temperance movement.
That is so fascinating. I mean, they really just didn't have anything to go by, did they? So they were actually doing a pretty good job, I think. In terms of the biography, just tell us a bit about the biography and where, the listeners can find out more about her life.
Yeah, so the book itself, it's called Our Fatima of Liverpool, and it's published by Beacon Books, but you can also get it from any online retailers like Amazon or any other bookshop online. And it's got her history. What's great about the book, I would say, is so the book is only about 75 to 80 pages, but then after that we have like a good 50 pages of appendices where it's Fatima Elizabeth's own writing, her own poetry, her own transcripts, and also her divorce petition. Brilliant. And where she talked about her own sacrifices that she went through, because becoming Muslim, and especially a female Muslim at the time, was very, very challenging because she was beaten on the streets. They threw stones at her, and also she was, on a number of occasions, she was pinned down, and horse's manure was wiped all over her face and all over her clothes.
Gosh,
and even the mosque, the very first mosque that opened was in December 20th of 1889. The windows were smashed. The mu'adhin, the one who called out to prayer, he was the very first mu'adhin. The very first call to prayer was given out in December 1889. Again, he was stoned. They even snowballed him. There was so much going on at the time. There was, the very first Muslim funeral that took place. Many well-wishers came.
I've got to say thank you so much for researching her story, and I think it's certainly a book that I'm going to get and just find out more about her. And please do join us again on the show at a later opportunity, because there's so much more that I'd love to discuss with you about her life. You take care. Thank you.
Likewise.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Hamid Mahmood there, who has written the biography of Fatima Elizabeth Cates, Britain's first Muslim convert, the second lady, I think, the second or the third person who converted way back in the Victorian era. Oh, na, na, na. Ooh, oh, 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 oh. 9. La, 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 la.